Back in that last module, when we did configure that backup copy job, I kind of teased the fact that these WAN accelerators can be used anytime you are replicating content from one place to the other. That can be a backup copy job, or it can be, in our case here, a replication job. And so these WAN accelerators are a tool used in either of these types of jobs to assist with the copying of content from one place to the other. What they do is employ a bit of data deduplication for the virtual machine disks and also the previous restore points to create a global cache of data blocks. This cache will exist on both sides, and so there is some storage that's required in order for these WAN accelerators to do what they're to do. They will then, because they know the content that they're transferring, begin transferring only the unique and non-redundant data blocks over the WAN. Virtual machines have a lot of similar pieces to them, and so if you have a WAN accelerator, one on one side and one on the other, and they happen to know which blocks are equivalent, well, you can simply just send the file hash for that data block and not have to send the entire bit of content over the wire. And so this process reduces the total amount of content that needs to go then over that wire, because you do have that cache digest data that exists there on both sides that they use to perform their analysis. Ultimately, the more similarity you have among the content you're transferring from one side to the other, the better compression you're going to get from these WAN accelerators. And I say compression here, but it just simply is not transferring that content because it has that similar file hash. Be aware also that, although not listed here, it is possible to configure these WAN accelerators in a many-to-one configuration. There is, in order to support this, a larger disk space required on the target side. But if you do have multiple data centers for which you're using a single DR site as that replica location, this many-to-one configuration, if you have the extra storage space, can be used to even further understand what kinds of file hashes need to exist over there on the target side. Now, generally, there's about 100 gigabytes that's required by default to set up these WAN accelerators on both sides, but it can be adjusted down to, I believe, about 10 gigabytes per VM OS type. So if you've got Windows Server 2000 and 03 and 16 and 19 and what have you, for each of those OS types, you'll need to set aside at least 10 gigabytes per OS type. Let's talk now about the process to then deploy out these WAN accelerators. And I think you'll find that this process is actually pretty cool in the way it's set up. Let's go here to our backup infrastructure right down here and go to WAN accelerators, which is an option right here. If you ever played with WAN accelerators before, usually these are separate pieces of sometimes hardware and sometimes virtual machines that you have to deploy out, sometimes from other companies entirely. What Veeam has done here is generate their own WAN accelerator. And so adding one is just simply done by adding a new WAN accelerator. For this, let's start here on the local side. Here's veeam1.company.pri. We will set the 6165 as the traffic port and will allow 5 simultaneous upload streams, with the idea here that more streams can increase the throughput but could saturate your WAN links. I'll choose next down here to deploy this out, so choosing next. Right here, we're now connecting to the server and identifying a location on which to store that cache. For this, I'll put the cache over on, I guess, the F drive right here and set the cache size not to 100 gigabytes, but down only to 10. We're only working with server 2019 here, so I can set it to 10 gigs for our demonstration environment. If I choose next over here, that takes us to the review page where we'll see that we are about to install the WAN accelerator here on this side. Let me choose apply, and we now go through then the deployment of the WAN accelerator. Again, if you've worked with any of those other solutions that sometimes require some pretty complicated setup, well, this process is remarkably simple in setting up this WAN accelerator. Now, as this goes about doing what it's doing, let me pause things here for just a second and repeat the process on the other side. I've done this here for Veeam 1, but we also need to deploy one of these out for Veeam DR as well. So give me a second here to deploy out the second WAN accelerator. And so after a second or so, we now have 2 of these different WAN accelerators that I've now installed here, one on Veeam 1 and one here for Veeam DR. The next step in this process is to go about then populating the cache with the content that the accelerator can expect to need to transfer from one side to the other. For this, we'll need to do it twice, one for each accelerator. And if I right-click here and choose to populate the cache, the only thing you really have to know here is we want to use the repository that's on the local side to populate the cache here. And so on this local side for Veeam 1, we have been storing pretty much all of our backups here into that Veeam 1 DAS repo number 1. We have other repos here, but this is where we've been storing all the backups we've created here so far. So let me use that as the backup repository I'll use for then generating all this cache content that we'll use to accelerate things. As you can see here, the process now continues in filling that cache with all the data that needs to be hashed here on the local side. I'm going to go ahead and actually hit the close button down here so that we can continue down this process and then repeat it down here for Veeam DR. And there's not really much you need to know here other than let's use the content already over there in that Veeam DR NAS repo to accomplish this task now here our second time. And so let me hit OK and then close to go about now populating then the remote cache over there on the DR side. I will allow this process to continue. It takes a pretty good amount of time for the cache to then populate, but once it does, we will be prepared then to start using these WAN accelerators for the acceleration of data transfer across the wire. Now be aware that from time to time, the cache data can actually get a bit corrupted or include irrelevant data. And so as we saw earlier, if you go back over here and right click, you can from time to time clear the cache and repopulate the cache if you're finding that your WAN transfers aren't working in the ways that you might think they should. Again, this is something you should only do if you're suspecting corrupted or irrelevant data there in the cache, but the option does exist here associated with the accelerator itself. Now, earlier we configured that backup copy job, and I just want to show you back over here under Home that we can go back to that backup copy job now that we have these WAN accelerators and modify it to use now the accelerators that we've installed. Let's go back over here to our backup copy job. This is the one that transfers the content from our local site over there to the DR site. For this, let me choose to edit in the properties of this backup copy job right down here. And I think if I go down here to, I think it's the data transfer tab, right down here under data transfer is where I can adjust this from being a direct connection from one proxy to the other, now to a connection that's supported by these WAN accelerators. Now again, in this environment, we're using the same server as our proxy and our WAN accelerator. You may not necessarily do that in production. If you've got a large environment, you may want separate different machines doing this. But this configuration change will now use the services on those proxies so that they are using that WAN acceleration function. So right down here for Veeam1 and right down here for VeeamDR at the target. Once I've done that, the next execution of this backup job, and in fact, it needs to be restarted here to use that WAN accelerator. This process will now use that WAN accelerator to speed up the transfer of content from one place to the other.